It's noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll pass it off to Evelyn Nelson to get us rolling.
Thanks, Christy, and welcome everyone. Glad to jump into October and our next ECHO session with everyone on the line today. Just a few house cleaning things first. We're fortunate to have our Telehealth ROCKS funding and support for the webinar series. We're lucky to work with several folks on the call today. Telehealth ROCKS is a federally funded program that works with school-based behavioral health, both with addressing social services needs and social determinants of health, and then helping youth and families around school-based services and supports and telementoring, just like we're all joining today. Today we're going to be talking about supporting suicide loss survivors. I know it's a really important but sometimes a difficult topic, so just know that we're also available during and after our talk today to provide resources and support. Just a few house-cleaning items. The session's being recorded, and we'll share that back with you all afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but please do unmute or use the chat to talk. We really had a rich discussion last time, a lot of great ideas on how to support students, so really appreciate continuing to use the chat with our session today. I believe everybody's been able to type in their name. We really appreciate that. That just helps us complete your certificates and get those emailed out to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Mold. I am the Zero Suicide Program Coordinator at Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ. I'm a licensed master social worker. And so in addition to helping different entities, different agencies implement zero suicide, I am also seeing clients for therapy services. So if you don't know about Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ, a little bit of background. We have two main programs. The first one, and the one that I work under, is Kansas Suicide Prevention Resource Center. So we do a lot of policy and advocacy work on all levels, big to small, or small to big, whatever way you want to think about that. We do a lot of I particularly do a lot of suicide care policy consultation and development. And that's true. I've worked with school folks, which I'm going to talk a lot about today, school districts, and then also mental health organizations like community mental health centers, private practitioners, and just other social service agencies to implement some better suicide care policy and practice. We also have Headquarters Counseling Center, and that is where we provide our 24/7 hotline services. So anyone can call us. We answer the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or 988 now. We do crisis calls, chats, and texts. And so we are available 24/7 in that capacity. We also have a therapy clinic, as I mentioned. I'm one of the clinicians that provide services in our clinic. Primarily, our services are provided by interns who are at a master's level or higher. So, well, no, that's not true. Just a master's level usually. So that's kind of some of the stuff that we do. And if you have any questions about our programs and stuff, I'm happy to answer those later on. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to start really quickly with some poll questions. The first question is, I just kind of want to understand the audience a little bit and kind of get to know you all and what you're working with in terms of a postvention policy, because today we are talking about supporting suicide loss survivors and particularly providing postvention. A lot of this, since you all are school-based folks, a lot of this is really specific to providing postvention services within a school system. So if we could go ahead and start the poll, and everyone can just kind of answer whether or not your school has a postvention policy or your workplace has a postvention policy. And if you don't know what a postvention policy is, it's essentially, do you have something in place? Do you have a plan in place for when a student dies by suicide? That's what we want to know. Should pop up.
It did.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Right? Yeah. Okay. So it looks like, it looks like about we're half and half. Half of us have postvention policy in place and half of us do not. Okay, that's good to know. How do I go to the next one? Oh,
So
I
if you
see.
just hit launch poll again, it'll be question 2. So we've
There
got
we go.
another question for everybody.
So question 2 is, how recently has it been updated? If you know. Half of us are going to say it's not applicable because we don't have one. Okay. So for the most part, it looks like we either don't have one or we don't know, and that's perfectly acceptable. A couple of us, it's been a little bit more recent. Okay, and then the last question is, have you been impacted by suicide? I should have put an option for both personally and professionally, because I think probably a lot of us have that as well. But that's okay. Whatever one feels most true for you. And it looks like a lot of us, it's been really a more personal experience, but there's a lot of professional impact as well. And some of us haven't been impacted by suicide, which is great. All right. Thank you all for participating in that. I think it'll be helpful in kind of our discussion a little bit later, just to know where everyone's at. So let's just kind of do a quick overview of what is postvention. Postvention is an organized response in the aftermath of a suicide. And the purpose of that response is to primarily facilitate some healing around the grief and the distress, the immediate shock, and all of those feelings that we're going to kind of talk about that can come up when a student dies by suicide in this particular setting, but really when a community member dies by suicide, because postvention is not just specific to schools. We also want to kind of mitigate any other negative effects of exposure. And one of the things that we find a lot of the time is that when a student dies by suicide or a community member dies by suicide, that can increase risk for a lot of people who are impacted. So we see that postvention actually often turns into identifying students who are at risk of suicide now as a result of this exposure or as the result of the grief of this loss. And postvention can turn into some intervention and then some prevention as well. So they're really all tied together. Go ahead and go to the next slide. The impact of suicide is really, really far reaching. It doesn't just look one way. We see a lot of different responses when we are working with communities who have lost. So let's, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to stick with the example of a student dying by suicide and working with the school community, because that feels most relevant. So we see students have a variety of responses, and the most important thing is that we just want to make sure that we're normalizing everyone's response. And a lot of times that's going to look like helping teachers understand what they might notice, helping students understand their own feelings, and letting all of the school body know that whatever is happening is normal. That doesn't mean that we're going to excuse inappropriate behavior, right? But it does mean that we might need to give some people some grace. A lot of times we might notice that there's like a lack of motivation or this resistance to letting the school day continue as normal. And we might have to take a couple of days where things aren't normal, where we really are just focusing on how are the students doing and really checking in. But we might see a lot of, full range of emotions from feeling really sad, lots of crying, to absolutely, I don't want to think about this. This doesn't impact me. I want things to function as normal. I'm not a cruel person. I just didn't know that person, or I didn't know that person and I'm really impacted by this death. So it's just this full range of different responses that we can see that often show up, and it's hard to kind of prepare ourselves to navigate all of those. So really, we want to make sure everyone's prepared to normalize those responses, to say, you know what, however you're feeling right now is okay. It doesn't make you a bad person. There are some things that we do want to try and discourage. Like, we don't want people to be blaming other people. We don't want people to be blaming themselves. And we don't want necessarily people to be sharing details of what they know about how this person killed themselves, if those details are going around. Usually that's like a trauma process that's happening for young people. And it's not intended to be like a malicious behavior, but it does kind of seem like gossiping. And a lot of times what we hear is like, this person keeps talking about really intrusive imagery that they kind of think must have happened or heard must have happened about how the student died. And I can't hear that. That's too triggering for me. So there's a lot of that dynamic that happens as well. So being able to kind of just get a pulse on what's going on in the school and recognizing that lots of students are going to need lots of different things. And that's also true for teachers and staff. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is where we kind of talk about what postvention can look like. So half of you don't have a postvention response. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask Danielle Yaley and Sydney Novotny, if she's here, to talk about their experience with postvention. And I'll introduce them in a few minutes. But what we've learned at KSPHQ when we've worked with various schools who have had to, unfortunately, provide postvention to their student body, is that the entire student body is affected somehow. And so the entire student body can benefit from postvention response. And that's also true when we think about siblings and other related students, even if they're not within the same school. So any siblings in the school district, we might need to have eyes on those students and really be checking in with them. So really, when a student dies by suicide, yes, the primary postvention response is going to happen within their school building, but the whole entire district needs to be aware of what's going on so that they can look out for any other students who might be at risk as well. When in some settings, we have had a student die who was a part of a particular sports team or sports teams. And so sometimes that looks like not just providing some type of response to the entire student body, but then specifically pulling out some teams or a specific student group to provide additional support and more specialized support, depending on what that student was involved in. So it can look nuanced in that way as well. In all cases where we've provided postvention response after a student's died by suicide, a lot of what happens is there's going to be a lot of phone calls from parents and concern from parents and guardians. Even if they didn't know the student that died, all of a sudden it's going to hit home. Wow, a student at my child's school died by suicide. That means that could have been my child. What do I do? So there's a lot of fear and concern that comes up from parents and guardians. And so we always encourage school districts to have some type of opportunity for parents to get support, whether that's in an informational meeting. One of the things that we've done is we've invited all parents to a parents' night where we have done like a warning signs and what to do if you are concerned about your child or another child training. And we do that really delicately, especially on the heels of a loss, because we don't want anyone to be blaming themselves, and we don't want parents to be like overly paranoid, right? But we do want them to feel prepared, and that is something that they can do in that moment to feel like they're doing what they can for their child. So that's something that we've done. We've also done more of an informal group processing where parents came and they just asked questions, and we just kind of let them have the floor, and we facilitated those conversations to the best of our ability. We've done more like individual, if there are specific parents who are really, really concerned and really have a lot of questions, we've done some individual conversations with them. Because sometimes what happens is when a student dies, there are going to be helpers that show up to the school. And these helpers are typically parents who just want to be there and who are also feeling impacted, right? So they want to be there for their students, but they're not mental health professionals. So it's important to kind of think about what do we do with those parents who show up? Where do we put them? How do we allow them to provide support without, while also making sure that the support that they're providing is safe and that these students are being served by mental health professionals in this specific instance, right? So there's a lot of those kind of nuances to think about as well. And one thing that we've learned is that when those helpers show up, really it's because they need someone to talk to. Yes, they want to be there for the students, but they also are impacted. And so we end up having conversations with them individually. When we think about the entire student body, one of the things, usually the way that goes is that we let the entire student body know, hey, these folks, we have counselors available all day for X amount of days. We let them know what the plan is, and we invite them to come. You can come talk individually, you can come talk in groups, small groups, whatever you need. And we just remind them daily that that is an option for them until it feels like, okay, students are kind of not coming anymore, because they will come in and they will take us up on that. And so we've talked to groups of like 10, that's the biggest usually, that wasn't like scheduled and planned. But we've talked to like groups of 3, and then we've talked to people individually. And then when we provide that support, and when I say we, KSPHQ helps with the post-vention response across Kansas. That is a service that we provide. But really, it's not just us. It's typically you all, the social workers in the school building, the school counselors in the school building, but also any other community mental health folks that might come to the table. And these are all things that, having a post-vention response plan in place, you'll have all of this ready to go. So you don't have to just scramble and figure out who's going to be here and when. And I'll talk about what that plan, that formalized plan can look like, because we have a resource. I'm rambling. So my point is, there are a lot of ways that Postvention looks. It's very nuanced, but it's also very unique to what the school needs, the school system needs. It can include the students in small groups. It can be individual support. It can be making sure that parents and guardians are getting the kind of support that they need. Teachers and staff as well, because they're going to be a huge part of your post-vention response. They're going to be the ones notifying students that this has happened. They're going to be the ones seeing what's going on in the classrooms. And so we need to make sure that they feel prepared and that they know what to do. They know what to do if they're worried about a student or if they're noticing specific behaviors or changes in behavior, but also that the teachers and staff are getting the support that they need because they're also grieving the loss. And then I already talked about other schools in the district. So that's kind of, when I say it happens in layers, it happens in layers. It's really intricate, I think. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to invite Danielle and or Sydney to kind of answer these 2 questions and to talk about their experience. They are both social workers at Baldwin High School. And I've worked a lot with them in developing their Post-Vention Plan, as they've had multiple losses, multiple student suicides, but other kinds of losses as well, where it just felt like one after another. So I'm going to let them speak to that and talk about what it was like for them to implement their new policy. I want to point out that you all, I believe, have all or either have already received or will receive a sample policy that we've put together in conjunction with Baldwin. And it's really thorough and it's really good in my opinion, but I'm biased because I helped make it. So you can see like what that can look like for your school, and you can adopt that and have that for free. So we'll let Danielle and Sydney talk, and then we'll answer any questions that you all have and wrap up.
Okay, so I'm Danielle Yaley. I'm we call it RAP social worker. I'm actually a liaison with the mental health center in Douglas County, placed at Baldwin High School.
And yeah, I'm Sydney Novotny, and I'm the general education social worker here at the high school.
So kind of to give a little bit of a time frame, we had our school had a suicide loss over the summer of 2018, and almost immediately after that, Sydney was hired. And then I came on in fall of 2019. And unfortunately, we had a suicide death in April 2021. And then October 2022, we had a medical death of a student. And then again in February 2020, we had another suicide loss hit our school. We fortunately, over the summer of 2021, we had worked with Erica extensively to get the Postvention plan in place. So kind of to address that first question of how did our experience impact our need for it. Neither of us were actually working after the 2018 loss, or at least not immediately at that time. And it was over the summer, so it was very complicated. But after the loss that we had in April 2021, like we knew, we called headquarters in. We were fortunate they were able to come in pretty, like they kind of heard through a small town community that there was things happening, and they reached out to us and they came in and really helped us kind of navigate through that. And then after things settled, we really knew like there are things we should have done differently. We should have done better. I think we did the best we could, but then we were like, we really needed something more concrete. So I think you're never really fortunate in these situations, but it was a huge help once we had that Post-Vention plan in place, because even when it was not a suicide death, we were able to use this plan, and it was just like seamless. Everyone had their job to do, and we knew what needed to do to provide support and respond. I mean, every situation is different, so no plan's going to actually cover probably every single little nuance, but I think it really helped us work through what to do.
Yeah. And then I think kind of what Danielle said kind of leads into the second question, but creating and implementing this plan, when we lost our student in March, we had that ability to have a few months to kind of process and work with Erica and Meg and really try to figure out like what a plan could look like. And then we took a lot of time over the summer to like really go through every possible scenario, looking at other losses that we've had in our community, whether they're related to suicide or not, adults, community members, students, young, old, and like try to think of every scenario where something could come up. And
like if it was the one loss was over the summer. So we kind of went through that. If we even talked through like, what if we learned about a loss in the middle of a school day? How do we respond? And what do we do? What are the steps? What if we find out after school or before school, when students aren't here? Because all those different things, you never want to think too much about these bad situations happening. But we had 3 in less than a year, so it really kind of went through different versions of it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I think everyone on our team can say like all that time and energy and effort that we put into creating that policy. When we lost our first student last year, which was like a medical emergency, we felt more confident in like what we were doing and supporting parents and students and our teachers. And I think too, I mean, anytime you lose anyone, it was so heavy on us, like as the caregivers in the school. And it kind of, even if we were like, I don't know if I can do this again, we had like that confidence and the backup to say like, no, this is what we have to do to support our kids and our teachers and our community. And it supported us even more than I think we kind of thought it might.
Yeah, I definitely, by last February, I think when we had the third loss, like I definitely had that moment of like, I can't do this again. And then, I take my moment, take care of myself. And then we kind of put together, we used our conference room where we kind of really broke down the duties and steps and it really made it so easy to do and go through it because it was already like all the pre-work was done.
Yeah, I think it takes like this frantic energy out of it, which is like you want to be calm when a crisis is happening. And so for you, I mean, witnessing the one in March and then just how, kind of all of us were frantic and trying to figure out what's best. I imagine that when you have that plan ready to go, you don't have to think too much about it, and it helps to just help you stay calm and just do what needs to happen for yourselves and the students.
Yeah, I think in the first loss we had, there was a lot of thinking and energy that was going towards, did we miss something? Did we miss something? What are we doing? What are we missing? And once we used this Post-Vention plan, it was like that took away a lot of that. Like we no longer have to worry. There's still a little bit of that because every situation is different, but it took away a lot of that to be like, just go through the steps. We've already thought about this. Something else I would add, we did have like a crisis plan in place, our district did. And after we went through the first loss, we realized how incomplete it was and how much was missing from it. So I guess I kind of share that as a, like, if you have one, you really should make sure it's really worthwhile and good. Because
make sure everybody knows it.
Help.
Right, because when there's so much turnover in the school, making sure everyone knows what the plan is too, and knows who's going to be primarily responsible for that response. I think that's a good point, Danielle. Any questions or anything else the two of you would add?
I don't think I have anything extra to add. I would love questions because if anyone wants to know anything more specific, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really like high, like very basic overview of Postvention. Like I said, Postvention is an extremely nuanced process, and also it is totally doable, especially when you have a plan in place. Creating the plan takes time, but like they said, it's worth the work for sure. Any questions for Danielle and Sydney, or any questions for me?
Danielle and Sydney, first, thank you all so much for joining and sharing your experiences. And I'm so sorry to hear about this loss. Incredibly sad. I'm curious, when you're thinking back on those experiences and sort of what you learned, is there anything that sticks out that's particularly surprising? So like, I never would have thought that this would be so important, or I really thought that this was going to come up, but it never did. Like, is there anything that really kind of stands out when you're reflecting back?
I think the first thing that kind of jumps to my head is which we made sure to put kind of in our Post-Vention plan, was like so much of the negative feedback we got from like community members, especially online, and dealing with like the personal attack I think teachers and staff and even kids felt. I would say 99% of the things that happened within our building were incredibly therapeutic and supportive, and people coming together during a crisis. But there was so much more negativity than I think I was kind of ready for. It was really hard to like process and deal with. And we tried to come up with some good plans for monitoring social media, who has responses, what kind of things that we just delete right out of our email or forward to our board, so that that's taken off our plate. But that was one that was really hard, I think, for me personally to kind of deal with.
I appreciate that, Sydney. And I imagine that kind of in that moment, it's probably a little bit kind of disorienting, right? To even know where the bad feeling is coming from. And then realizing that it is from perhaps like this external noise and probably a lot of misinformation and other friends who are having big feelings and perhaps not making the best choices when they're knowing how to process it. But just, I love how you identified kind of some boundaries, like some even like kind of rote sort of static responses that could be sent, some automatic, this goes here, this is the person who has the authority to do something about it, I don't have to look at it, like those kind of protections.
And then we
I
were
really
able to
appreciate
have
that.
some really good conversations with some community members about the things that we actually had in place, like educating people on like what we do in a school and what our role is, and our collaboration with headquarters and all of these things, which was nice to come from that, being able to educate people on all the hard work that we've done and that we do care. And it is hard when we lose a student. But some of that background prep helped, I think, as we move down the line.
I would just say, and it kind of ties into that, like it's the array of responses after a crisis. It's just so varied. You have students who have a response, not because they knew that student, but because they've had their own loss with suicide or experience with suicide, and it triggers something in them. You have community members who kind of react with some anger and blaming because they want to understand. They want to be able to say, this is the problem, we can fix it. So, I mean, we had some teachers that would tell us like, well, I have seniors and that was a freshman, it's not going to affect them. It really is. So just being prepared for a whole spectrum of responses. I guess that's what kind of sticks out to me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate that also echoes what Erica shared, right? And so that also kind of helps to normalize that entire spectrum of responses is completely valid and completely okay, but also helps us in terms of, as anybody prepares and doing what you can to prepare, just to know that's going to happen. And Erica, I really appreciate what you said in terms of the parents and caretakers and other adults who show up to help and kind of what maybe and to help, absolutely, and maybe not even knowing why they showed up, but how much of ourselves we bring to processing any of this kind of thing. And so no matter who it was who died or how it happened or when or any of the details, that of course I'm going to look at that young friend and think that could have been my child, or what about my brother, or what about my parent or my neighbor, or finding a way to personalize it, which then changes the shape of the grief and the challenge there. So thank you. I appreciate you all sharing kind of that reflection there.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat about resources outside of the building. And so I mean, I think that what we recommend is typically to make sure that you're making referrals to your community mental health center, to any other private practitioners in your area, really making referrals and recommendations for additional support for any students who might need it. And then also providing the 988 resource as well. So the crisis line information. Danielle and Sydney, would you add anything else?
I don't know if what they were wondering about, if you meant the crisis, like in that crisis moment, like, or instance, but we were fortunate that we had headquarters come in. I worked for the community mental health center, so we had providers from the community mental health center. Our super got on the phone and called, I think 3 or 4 surrounding districts. And so, and the first loss, which was like our students found out at first or second hour, like they found out at school. So there was we needed a bigger response for that. We had lots of outside resources coming in for that response. But others outside of resource, yeah, a lot of, in general, community mental health center, private providers, even pediatricians, medical providers sometimes can help. Okay.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, if you have a school district in Kansas, and this happens at your school, you can call us me, and we can help with your postvention response, whether that means we're showing up in person to provide some counseling services or helping you walk through what your postvention response needs to look like, or just supporting your crisis response team as you all do that. It can look any way it needs to, but if you need consultation or you need some boots on the ground, someone to show up to actually provide counseling for the student body, or teachers or parents or whoever, you can call it, and that's a free service that we offer at KSPHQ is Postvention. So just, I don't think a lot of people know that, and I want everyone to know that that's a thing.
And I could not recommend that enough for people to utilize that. Even I think each experience we've had has been a little different on how you guys have provided help to us here in Baldwin. But honestly, I think the most helpful is supporting our team and helping us process and just being there if we need them. And that's how you provide the best services to your kids. It's having backup.
KSPHQ, they came out, we did some targeted, within the first 2 weeks of groups, parent groups, student groups, just staff available. And just, they just sent in a conference room and available. And for a while there, we did some targeted referring, we'd reach out to some kids and kind of connect them. But I think for the rest of the school year, you guys came out once a week and we're just here. And even if kids didn't come talk to you, and staff too, because you had staff that you talked to also, I think it was a good sign and symbol that you were here. We weren't forgetting about this. There's something that just happened and went away.
Yes, because a lot of kids feel that. They feel like, oh, this is going to be a big deal for a week and then everyone's going to forget about it and move on, but I can't move on. And to let them know that they don't have to move on. Yes, things we have to have a normal school day at some point. And we have to encourage that things are going, moving in the way that they should be. But that doesn't mean that your feelings are going to go away. This isn't a quick process. And so being able to just have that presence and that reminder of yes, this happened and we aren't forgetting that, can be really powerful to students.
Erica, I might add, and then I see we have another question here. And I think Danielle and Sydney, you were sharing too, that after one of these tragedies that, the superintendent got on the phone and was connecting with surrounding districts. And I think that that's one of the pieces that I've heard school, particularly school counselors, but also school leaders reflect on, is that oftentimes when any kind of tragedy occurs like this, that there's just a lot of very well-intentioned, often well-credentialed, appropriately credentialed adults who show up at the site. So if it's school counselors from a surrounding district or from the community, and that can be incredibly helpful, invited or not, that those friends come in. But just as a reminder that the folks in the school district or in the school building who were in charge before are still in charge now, and those rules and policies that did exist still exist. And that's kind of how that's how order happens, right? So when we start thinking about, especially having community mental health professionals come in, do they understand kind of what happens with confidential information? If they are talking to a friend in a school context, do they know what kind of the rules are of how that all works? And just making sure that that's in place and something to kind of talk about ahead of time, so that and afterwards there's just so much chaos that if and there are districts that have put that in place, that this is our B team, our C team, this is who's going to be in the building. Let's meet, let's have coffee so that we know each other, and just kind of talk through and revisit those pieces. So just wanted to add that.
And I can kind of tag onto that too. After the first loss we had, there was some chaos with our super was calling these people in. They would show up and I was like, I don't know who you are. And somehow they'd land with me. And I'm like, I guess go over there. And that was something we built into our Post-Vention plan, was who's going to be in charge of kind of being the contact person for these supports that we're bringing in, and assigning them of where they're going, debriefing them a little bit. So that we had that lived experience of some of that chaos and good. We are so grateful for all the support and help. Don't want to downplay that at all. But we built that in to have some more that flow a little more smoothly.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a huge recommendation. It should be built in. It should be, because, I am the kind of person that I like to walk into a place and take over. That is naturally my instinct. But in this setting, obviously that's not my place. And so even if the person who's primarily responsible at KSPHQ for postvention response, I know that my role is to show up and ask what they need, right? And to be able to support whatever the school needs, because I don't get to make those choices for them. I can give recommendations if they ask for them. But I think that when something so tragic happens, there are a lot of people like me who want to show up and fix it and want to take over. And so if we can be prepared to kind of funnel those helpers into one room, get debriefed, get tasked, right? Then that instinct for them is gonna kind of quiet down a little bit because now they have a task. So that can be really, really helpful.
I appreciate that, Eric, and also just thinking for those of us perhaps who might be in that situation to go into another space, and thinking about all of the people in our community. So if it was any kind of tragedy, that being able to do that, to walk into a space and say, "Hi, my name is Melissa. I am a psychologist. I can help with these 3 things," and thinking about how can I be helpful? Right. So immediately identifying yourself, who you are, how you can be helpful, and then asking someone to tell you what to do, knowing that it's not your context, right? And so someone else is in charge. You can be there to support, but that way you can make sure that you're kind of following along and being really helpful and not, overloading the system. Susan, thank you so much for waiting for us. So Susan is sharing, we had a situation like that where we had a student suicide and then spring break, and then COVID shut down. We're still reeling and recovering from that. We just couldn't, quote, get to the student body in many ways for months.
Right. And that's one of those situations where you can have a beautiful postvention plan and then a pandemic can happen, right? And it's like, that's not a part of the plan. How do we respond? And so there are, I think, and I could be wrong. So if Sydney and Danielle, if you know more, if you remember, speak up for sure. But we had to talk about, like, how do we notify students who are remote only? And so that's something that all of a sudden we had to start thinking about. That wasn't written into any postvention policy books, right? Like any of the tools that we were using to create a plan, they didn't have considerations for the pandemic in those templates. And so it's really hard. And I just have a lot of compassion for that experience for all of the students, but also for the teachers and staff that weren't able to really support the students in the way that you obviously want to. I don't know how to fix that, right? Except for to think about it now. But yeah, that's really, really hard.
Like, I would just add, so before we made our postvention plan, our new one, we were in a hybrid schedule when we had the first suicide loss. So we did have to do, that was something we talked a lot about, is like all these different scenarios of our students. And we were not hoping for any more hybrid or any more COVID when we were made our postvention plan, but we were factoring in that, like, what if they're not in school? What if we find out on a Friday at 4 o'clock? What if we find out on a Sunday? How do we communicate, and how do we try to offer supports? Obviously, Susan's situation, you can't always prepare for all those things, but we did try to factor in some of those things of how do we communicate? How do we get resources out? I don't know, it helps a little bit.
Yeah. How can you make the school available for those students who aren't physically in the building? Which is something that if you all, if you need help problem solving that, let me know. But it might be, I can't remember for sure, but it might be already written in that sample policy. Any other questions, or how are we doing on time? We still got about 15 minutes. So this can definitely be, I was hoping that this would definitely be more conversational because postvention is so nuanced. I just didn't want to get too far into the weeds.
So I have lots of questions always. And so
I
if
love
nobody
that.
else asks a question, I always will. Erica, I'm wondering if you might kind of talk about sort of recommended or best practice in addressing grief, loss, trauma, and being really super considerate from like a religious cultural perspective. So how do we both uh, be our real and authentic selves, and also not push our real and authentic selves on other friends in those moments when things are so challenging?
Ooh, that's a big question.
So do we pray with people? Do we say that God had a plan? You know, like is that something that we say, or do we not say it? What can we say instead? How do we kind of handle that space?
So my recommendation would be, and my recommendation obviously aligns with best practice, would be that you can validate, you know, if somebody else is navigating their grief by trying to or by saying things like, well, I just think God had a plan, or I just think this is how, you know, everything happens for a reason. We hear that a lot. It is okay to say, it sounds like you're taking comfort in your faith right now, and that's really helping your grief. So you can kind of reflect on that a little bit, but blanket statements to a large group of people, or even a small group of people, as the professional in the room, I highly do not recommend that is what we say. Instead, we say things like, we don't always know why suicide happens. It's really complex, and it's a very personal decision that somebody makes. We try to say what's really true, and what we do know about suicide, as opposed to trying to use these platitudes to comfort other people. We can ask questions like, what helps you feel comforted in this moment, and allow space for that. But I definitely don't recommend, unless, I mean, as far as praying with people goes, I'm more open to that. If they ask, will you pray with me? If that's something you feel comfortable doing, you do you. But I'm not going to offer to pray with someone, even if that's something that I would do on my own, right? Like, it's really about providing them what they need in that moment, and we don't get to assume what that is.
I think that's really helpful, and even kind of the very end of that, so that our role in that scenario is to hold space for people, to be responsive, to follow their lead, to try to perhaps gently, not even correct, but just gently shape kind of misconceptions, or kind of inaccurate information, but again, gently pushing back, but really just being responsive and following their lead, which to me sounds a lot like kind of what we were talking about earlier, in terms of, you know, if someone's going to show up as a helper into a different space that is not theirs, that, like, again, follow the lead of the kind of the person or the system or the culture kind of you're in. And that way it's really clear, you know, I'm here as a helper. I'm not going to be able, I don't have the answers. I don't have the magic wand. I can't fix it. But I can be in this space with you, and this is really hard. And we can have those hard feelings together, and I'll be right here next to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will say that one part of the sample policy that you all will receive, there is there's an addendum, or an appendix, appendix F, and it has a resource. So even if you don't adopt this policy in your school district, which obviously, like, that's ultimately what I want everyone to do, is to have a policy. But there's a resource in that packet that's specific talking points for working with students who are impacted, or teachers and staff who are impacted, or even parents. You can use these talking points for really anyone, but it really helps give some guidance on what can we say that isn't that is accurate and true and comforting, without without trying to make sense of something that we can't make sense of, I guess, if that makes sense. So that's something that I highly recommend everyone checking out. Let's see.
So Susan is sharing in the chat that maybe this came up, but we made a new postvention plan that included non-school site personnel who are in charge of the postvention. While the building personnel obviously know the students in that building best, they may also not be able to lead in the early hours of a crisis due to their own
Yes.
grief and loss.
Yes.
So Erica, do you have a response for Susan?
Yes. That's a really good point, Susan. Thank you for bringing that up. With the postvention plan, you want to have an idea of who is going to be responsible for what before a suicide ever happens, right? And there has to be room in that plan for flexibility so that if someone who is supposed to be responsible for a specific task is so impacted that it doesn't make any sense for them to be involved in this postvention, they get to step out and somebody else gets to tag in. So I think that really, you know, like we've said kind of over and over again, we want to be as prepared as we can be, but we also know that this is impactful for everyone who's providing the response. I can say, even as someone who came in from the outside who didn't know the student who died at Baldwin, I felt very connected to that loss, and I still do feel very connected to that loss because I was such a part of that postvention, providing support to the student body and the teachers that were there. So I think that it just makes a lot of sense to consider what do the people who are providing the response need in this moment, and how can they get their needs met, because we can't provide quality postvention if we are also not well. Does that make sense?
I'm nodding my head as if I was Susan, and I'm like, yep, I'm Susan, and so I can't speak for Susan. But I think that makes sense, and also that it's still, so if the school, and I would say this for any org, but if the school is then putting that in place, it is still the school ultimately that's in charge, right? If you're handing over the baton to other folks, you're still then crafting the plan. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think COVID, for better or worse, required a lot of folks to take a look at all of their crisis plans and kind of reconsider, we really need to define things by role and function, and not just know that, like, oh, just go ask Sandy, because it can't be tied to a person, right? Because we, in a crisis, like, we need, go ask the person at the front desk, ask the person wearing the red badge, like, it needs to be attached to a thing, so then we can kind of share the load in different sorts of ways. And so if sharing the load means, getting helpers from outside, then that seems to make a lot of sense.
And also another reason why you want to update your postvention plan every year, because there actually is a recommendation that you have a specific person responsible for a task, like they're the primary person responsible for this task, and then there's a backup person responsible for the task in case that person can't do it. And so if there is a responsibility that's tied to somebody's name, we want to make sure that that person's still there next year. So making sure that you're updating your postvention plan annually is really important. You can also do it by position as opposed to by their name. It just kind of, it's up to you.
Erica, could you speak to any special considerations with siblings, or, supports with siblings, or helping other students as they're interacting with siblings?
It's hard, right? Like, we can't really have control over how students are treating the siblings of the person who died. Sometimes what we see is that student's family kind of becomes this spectacle where we're all just like, oh, there they are. There's their mom. There's the person who died's mom, or her brother, or his brother, or whoever. And it's hard to control the response. But as far as like the school's response goes, we really encourage, we know that when someone experiences a suicide loss, especially if they were, in, close to that person, that their risk for suicide increases. And so we want to make sure that someone is checking in with those siblings regularly for a while, so that they're being screened regularly, that we're making sure they have the accommodations that they need to be able to finish the school year in whatever way that needs to look for them, so that there's some flexibility and grace for them where they might need extensions on assignments, or they might need some, whatever those accommodations look like. And also that they're getting everything that they need in terms of support. So as far as just special considerations go, I think it's just a matter of making sure that someone is following up with those students those siblings on a regular basis. And that would be true even if they weren't in the same building as the student who died. So if, let's say, the student was in high school and they have a sibling in middle school, making sure that whoever is the middle school social worker or counselor or whatever is doing that work to check in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We've just got about 2 minutes left, and I don't want to disrespect anyone's time. I want to say thank you so much to Danielle and Sydney for being here and for speaking about your experience at Baldwin. You're two of my favorite people, so it's great to see you. And if yeah, I'm still open for questions, but I'll pass it off to Christy as well. Oh, we could talk about these takeaways real quick, but I think we kind of already have. Having a post-vention plan in any setting is a really good idea. It's really important to just think about having that in place. If you need help getting that in place, feel free to contact me. I will put my email in the chat. Remember that postvention can be, it can eventually become intervention and prevention, because we can often identify people who are at risk of suicide as a result of our postvention response, and any reaction to a suicide loss is normal. So we want to make sure that we're recognizing that grief is messy and unique to each individual. Those are my takeaways.
Thank you. We just so much appreciate your information today, Erica, Sydney, and Danielle. We hope to have folks join us at our next session on Tuesday, October 11th. And just a reminder, we'll be sharing out the slides and materials and sending that to your email. So again, thanks for everyone. We'll see you next time.